Good morning and welcome to.
Okay, I can show you this. Yeah, is it true? Yes, I'm going to start it from the beginning.
I'm sorry, I have to wait till they finish with the PowerPoint.
I'm afraid that somebody could help me when I'm talking, just to pass through there. Is there any way like you could help me instead of me constantly watching it, because I'm reading. Will you look at me and I? Yeah, I mean I can do that.
Mona, can we start?
It's a much good. That could show you
what. Welcome to today's meeting on Vanguard Women in the Iranian Election Campaign and Protest. This, as you know, has been a very unusual elections in Iran. And for the first time we saw women campaigning vigorously and openly. The first time women played an important role was under Khatami, but this time it was very different. You not only had a large number of women in the campaign, and also the four candidates had women advisors, and the wife of Mousavi, Zahra Rahnavard, was quite present. I'm not going to get into any details because our panelists are going to cover all these issues. Each of our panelists will speak for 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and answers. Nayere will give the overview. She will speak for 20 minutes. Because, there is an overflow on the sixth floor. We will take their questions in writing. And could I remind you, please, to close your cell phones because it interferes with the live webcast that we have. And our speakers too, if your cell phones are on, can you please close them? Nayere, you go.
Okay.
I'm sorry, you have their bios, so I'm not going to introduce them and take your time for that. Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. It's good to be back to the Woodrow Wilson Center as a former scholar here. And I'd like to thank Dr. Hale Esfandiari for organizing this very timely and important panel. She, as a Vanguard herself, has always been keen on drawing our attention to the women's role and the gender aspects of any upheavals that happen in the Middle East. And also thank Mona Youssef for her friendly and efficient management of this event. We all know that women's massive, what a mistake. Not a good start, I'm sorry. Women's massive presence in the past few months, actually, not only the weeks, both during the campaign and also in the events aftermath of the results of the election, has struck many inside and especially outside Iran. Thousands of women of all walks of life, different classes and from different social strata, sometimes covered in black chador, black veil, sometimes barely covered with a short scarf, and dressed in very non-traditional, modern way. Young and old, they took to the streets first to campaign for their candidates and then mobilize also others to vote for change, basically, and then to protest their stolen votes. Though of diverse age, ethnic and socioeconomic and cultural political backgrounds, most of these women appear to be younger, from urban educated middle class with secular orientation. But of course, by secular here, I don't mean to be non-religious. Many of these women are believers. Many of them seem to be Muslim. But many of them seem to be sick and tired of a religious state and of theocracy. And they seem to be voting and campaigning for a change toward pluralism, toward democracy, and eventually separation of religion and state. They took part in these peaceful demonstrations alongside with men, not behind men, not in segregated manner that we have been used to see in the past 30 years of Iran. This was very important sign. They protested and they campaigned alongside with men, sometimes even in the forefront, before actually men, in front of men. Even the first icon of this impressive civil rights and civil disobedience movement turns out to be a woman, Neda Agha Sultan, who so innocently and brutally was gunned down and died in front of the world's eye. Let me pause on Neda just for a minute to show how ironically a true representative of this green movement she is, and how her characteristics reflect the main characteristics of the current pro-democracy movement in Iran. She was a young woman, 27-year-old, of Azeri ethnic background, a student of philosophy, accompanied by her music teacher. These are all very meaningful in Iran today. A philosophy student accompanied by her music teacher at the time of demonstration. She was not an Islamist, obviously. She was against fundamentalism. She appeared very secular and modern. And she was not a member of any political groups, nor was associated with any political ideology. She was neither, like in the beginning, in the 1979 revolution, women icons were usually very militant, belonged to either Mujahideen or Fadayin or supporters of Shariati and Khomeini. But this time, this woman kind of represented ordinary women who just came to protest her stolen vote, so demand her civil and political rights, and to express her desire for change. She represents millions of women and the youth, half of the youth also being women, who are now manifesting a post-fundamentalist, post-Islamist, post-ideological, post-revolutionary, and globalized political culture, and the pragmatic discourse that is now dominating this movement and the political culture of Iran. She is indeed a true and representative iconic figure in a movement that has a political culture remarkably distinct from the political culture and the discourse that prevailed Iran during the 1979 revolution. So this was an image that she was representing to the world that has been rather unknown or less known to the outside world, because we used to see images very different from the one we saw in these demonstrations, especially by the image of Neda. The current movement is non-ideological, non-fundamentalist, non-violent, and non-revolutionary. The prominent elements of the current discourse are at least the following: emphasis on human rights, women's rights, something that was almost absent in 1979 revolution. Concerns and rights of ethnic minorities, religious minorities, rule of the law, justice, transparency, honesty and ethics in politics, something that has been increasingly missing, especially under Ahmadinejad. People were tired of hearing lies and fabricated statistics and all that. And the outrage caused by the increasing and brutal onslaught on civil rights by the government of Ahmadinejad under the rubric of the so-called social safety plan, طرح امنیت اجتماعی. Through that, economy and foreign policy were important issues for the whole process, for the campaign and the debate during the campaign. Over 20% inflation, rising and soaring prices, rising rates of unemployment, especially among women, and all that. And also the confrontational and hostile foreign policy of Ahmadinejad, the denial of Holocaust, and all that brought Iran into isolation, and a lot of economic sanctions that made life more difficult for people. But in addition to these two important factors, that is the economy, mismanagement of economy and all that, and foreign policy, social issues, cultural issues, civil rights, have been as important a factor to mobilize people, especially the younger generations and women, to not only see the campaign and voting, despite the initial apathy among many people who were cynical about even participating in the voting. They realized when they saw increasing changes in the discourse of the campaigner, the two reformers, who had surrounded themselves with good teams of reformers, especially Karoubi's team was very impressive in the number of intellectuals around him. And also the changes in the gender aspects of the reformers who were campaigning made many women and men to see voting as the only tool they had, the only way they could express themselves, and they could hope for some change and some moderation in the dominant politics in Iran. But all these changes that we see, this presence of women and all that, did not come out over the night. This has been the result of many years of rather quiet educational and organizational work carried out by many small groups of women and men focused on civil rights, especially women's rights. Actually, the background of what we see today goes back, I would say, 200 years ago, which dates back to the constitutional revolution in which women took part, and over 100 years of women's struggle in Iran for equal rights and for reform. So not only the changes excuse me, and reforms that took place during the former regime of the Shah and the resulted new middle class, small but very visible professional middle class women excuse me, who would not submit to sex segregation and exclusionary policies of the Islamic Republic, and made up the core of women who resisted and started to articulating demands of women and genderizing the resistance against the repressive Islamic government. That socialized group, though small, were later helped with a new generation of kind of a newcomers of women who participated in the anti-dictatorial, anti-imperialist movement, as they called it in 1979. And the process of that revolution socialized and politicized millions of women who were formerly rather marginalized or would not participate in the former regimes and the politics of the former system. These women who were so enthusiastically engaged in the politics of the time increasingly became disillusioned about the promises of the Islamic utopian justice. And they, by increasing repression on the individual freedoms, and especially retrogressive trends of laws that made and reinforcement of many background aspects of Iranian traditions and cultures, like reinforcement of polygamy, sigha, the temporary marriage, sex segregation, discrimination on basis of gender, all that made many women, including Islamic and Islamist women, feel almost betrayed and disappointed, if not betrayed, by the promises or the vision they had for an Islamic government. So, therefore, increasing number of women joined that core of professional new middle class women, middle-aged women by then, younger ones, who started resisting and looking for change. Some of them started taking back the monopoly of interpretation of Islam from the clergy and started studying Islam for themselves and coming up with kind of Islamic feminism. And some, the secular women, they converged, sometimes they diverged despite tensions, and they collaborated. So all that ended up with start of an emergence of a very vigorous movement, which was manifested especially during the reform era of Khatami's time. Actually, it was in great part thanks to women's massive vote for Khatami that Khatami could win this upset, unexpected victory of a moderate cleric, and start of 1997 era of the reform. So I'm saying this to show that women's engagement and role in Iran's politics did not start a few weeks ago. It has been there for, as I said, even going back to 100 years ago, but especially about 10, 15 years ago, that a feminist, a very gender conscious and focused movement of women activists with deliberate efforts, with a long-term plan of engagement and subversion from within and from without the system has begun in Iran, and we now today see this the manifestation of this rather quiet process that perhaps many of us didn't notice before. Why this happened? Why Iran unexpectedly have such a strong women's movement that I would argue is the strongest in the Middle East now, is due to an interplay of local global factors, a set of factors that I don't have time to go into them. But just as a kind of list, I would mention demographic changes, this growing middle class in general, and middle class, highly educated women in particular, so much educated that women actually now we know are getting even better educated than men. They are making up 63% of university students. There is a drastic decline in fertility rate and increasing rates in employment, especially in the informal sector of economy, if not the formal economy. The growing women's press, starting with Zanan, the magazine that just got closed a year ago under Ahmadinejad, and many internet journals and weblogs that my friend Patty will talk about. Changes in sexual mores, a sort of a quiet sexual revolution that has been going on and many scholars have been writing about, and polarization of political culture, especially under Ahmadinejad, that the state elite after some moderation and pragmatism that we saw both under Rafsanjani and especially later under Khatami, shifted under Ahmadinejad from conservative pragmatism toward a much more militant Islamism, while the public, on the other hand, in general have become more liberal and more secular, as some of the research, for example, Dr. Mansour Muaddel's surveys in 2000 and 2005 shows that how the population of Iran have becoming increasingly more secular, more ready to accept women's role, especially leadership role, and how their attitude toward patriarchy is changing toward more egalitarian attitudes. And there are lots of shifts that, so it looks like the society was going to another direction while the government became more conservative, more fundamentalist. And there was therefore, what we are seeing is that in current conflict is in part a head-on collision between these two subcultures, two Irans, a dual society that are kind of clashing with each other, two Islams and two political cultures, two different discourses, in which the gender issue and women's role plays very prominent and sometimes even subtle and very nuanced manner. The gender politics was manifested almost clearly during the 2005 presidential election as well. I have actually documented that in detail in a forthcoming article in a book that should come soon, specifically looking at how gender politics played out during the presidential elections in 2005, the 9th presidential election. For the first time, it was then that the reform candidate Moin came out with his wife during the campaign track, not as much prominently as Mousavi did, but nevertheless it was the first time. It was for the first time that Ayatollah Rafsanjani, a cleric, appeared with his wife. When he was voting, his wife was accompanying him. This was the first thing, again, appearing in Iran, which again showed that even Rafsanjani, even then in 2005, felt compelled in order to woo women's votes to come along with his wife. For the first time, a woman spokesperson was designated for Moin. Elahe Kulai, who is a very prominent activist and a Muslim feminist, played a very vocal role in the 2005 elections. So, and then also a coalition of women activists was formed, a coalition that had been actually formed following an inspiration they got after the Nobel Peace Prize was announced for Shirin Ebadi. They formed a coalition called Hamandishi Zanan, co-thinking of women. I don't know how to translate that, but several women of different backgrounds came together and created kind of a ongoing discussion groups, and they engaged in the election of the 9th election, and they waged a demonstration in front of University of Tehran and specifically demanded change in the constitution, again for the first time. Now, it is in that background that we see in the 10th election, interestingly, one important distinction is that unlike the 9th election, that many women and men, younger activists, students, and especially pro-reform activists stayed away from the election and kind of boycotted the election because they were so dismayed and disappointed with some failures of Khatami. But this time, learning perhaps some lessons from that boycott, which helped in part, was a factor in winning Ahmadinejad during that election. This time, they noticed that the more they get engaged and the higher the turnout, it is less likely that Ahmadinejad can win this time. So it was in order to get rid of Ahmadinejad, and also because of what not only people had learned from the 9th election, but also what the candidates had learned. our good friend Mehrangiz Kar, who's here, she wrote a very good piece saying that all sides have learned their lessons. All sides are not speaking differently. The candidates knew that this time they cannot take for granted the votes of the pro-reform people. They had to address their issues. Therefore, you could see that in Mousavi's platform, for the first time, especially initially if it was kind of vague, but as we got closer to the time of the election, Mousavi came up with clear statement about women's rights. He and his wife, Zahra Rahnavard, who I'm sure many of you know, her background, a very active woman, a university chancellor, and a Muslim feminist herself, even though she has written against feminism. But she and her husband, both of them, especially Zahra Rahnavard herself, sometimes more strongly articulated women's issues during the campaign. They promised that they will address two specific demands that another coalition of women raised, and that is the joining to the CEDAW Convention, International Convention against, for elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and also to revise 4 specific articles in the Constitution, 19, 20, 21, and 115 articles. Now, they specifically addressed those issues, Mousavi and his wife. Even Karoubi, a cleric, thanks mainly to his team and also a strong wife he has, who also was very active in the campaign, a very conservatively dressed Muslim woman. Nevertheless, she's a very powerful woman, a former manager of a hospital and very involved in politics. And also a woman, former deputy Jamile Kadivar, who was active in her headquarters, in Karoubi's headquarters of campaign. They also address women's issues, not only women's issues, but for the first time, ethnic issues. These two were important, distinctive elements of this campaign, to specifically talk about ethnic issues, religious minorities. Even Jamile Kadivar talked about Baha'is, which is a taboo subject. And a woman, it took a woman reformer to speak about that. Men didn't dare to, looks like. And also women's issues very specifically. Even Mohsen Rezai, who was a candidate of the conservatives, brought his wife along, and during a film that Rakhshan Bani Etemad, one of the feminist activists and feminist movie makers, made of this campaign and interviewed these candidates. Of course, she wanted also interview Ahmadinejad. He would decline. But he interviewed these 3 candidates along with their wives and specifically addressed women's issues. So all this made women more keen on participating, and they, especially students, the same group of students who had boycotted the 9th election, this time 56 groups of students actively participated in the campaign. And women, the coalition they made, which was a coalition of women which was around or focused on specific demands of women, played very active and important role in bringing about gender issues, making the gender issues very prominent during the campaign. And they had this experience of the coalition building during Ahmadinejad when he proposed a very retrogressive family bill in 2008 to further reinforce polygamy and all sorts of regressive anti-women measures. That the coalition they had made was very effective. So they used the same skills they had developed during that coalition and made women's issues very prominent. So with that background, then we see that the women so enthusiastically participating in voting, and then what happens is that the shocking results of the elections, and they basically very clearly understood that this was a rigged and fraudulent results and elections, and they took on the streets. And after that, you also a lot of not only non-violent nature of these impressive demonstrations, but also rather some feminine elements in it. The whole demonstrations are very poetic. For the first time, you see a lot of poetry being recited during the demonstrations, and the banners they are carrying have a lot of poems from Shamlu and from other poets. It's very artistic, and artists, especially women artists, have been playing very important role in this movement. From Rakhshan Bani Etemad, Zahra Rahnavard herself being an artist, Mousavi himself being an artist. That's why I'm saying this revolution, kind of revolution, social, I wouldn't say revolution, but this civil rights movement is very different from what we have seen so far with its with the songs and with the themes and with even the color and all that, and the non-violent nature of it. So during all these protests after the election results, women played again very important role. Although it wasn't necessarily very gender specific, it was mostly around general civil rights and where is my vote, as the main issue. Nevertheless, women managed, although many people were surprised by the extent of the outpouring of people and all that, but still, after, especially when the attacks started, that Khamenei began to threaten people and the police attacked people and the killing and all that, women activists kind of started getting together and trying to see, okay, how we can now, with a more gender-specific issues, play a role here. So they have now formed like mourning mothers who have called for weekly rallies in the different parks to mourn for and demand the release of political prisoners and mourn for their martyrs. And also the statement came signed by 400 women condemning the violence and so forth. But now there are debates and literature by feminists are coming out to analyze what has happened and to decide where we should go from here, which should be very fascinating. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Naira, for this wonderful overview. The women Naira mentioned were recently referred to in a website close to the intelligence ministry as the women's commandos, Kommandoy Zanan, and they argued that Mousavi is perfectly happy to withdraw, but his wife has threatened him that she will pursue the campaign. If he wants to sit back, that's his decision. So there is a lot to come and a lot to see. We now move on to Jale Lakhner Gohari, who is a physician. She's the first time speaking at the Wilson Center. She's based in Austria, and she has a very provocative title, Yes, They Did. But she's going to speak on Iranian women's new strategies, but also in what's going on in Europe regarding these recent activities. Jolie, 15 minutes.
I will try to stick to that. Good morning, Holly. Good morning, panel. Good morning, wonderful audience, many Iranian faces and many others, and this is the beauty of what I'm experiencing here. I'm most honored to have been invited to this panel and to talk after Naira, address the same issues is like bringing water to the sea. Nevertheless, I'm here and I have to attempt to tell you my activist point of view and the meticulous interest with which I have been following the events in Iran, particularly ever since the revolution, when all this sudden change in the fate of Iranian women seemed to emerge. And forgive me for reading out of my notes because I have to dismiss some of them because so much has been told. Strategies of Iranian women to approach the realization of their demands have qualities which are quite unprecedented in the history of Iran, and which were developed under circumstances which were not at all favorable and at odds with their goals. This is, I think, a very important aspect, and therefore the interest how it was done. To the observers, these qualities can be seen as markers, also visible, as was so beautifully said by Naira Tohidi, on the package which was visible during, before, during, and after the elections in Iran. The feminine color of the movement in its best sense, the markers of the feminist Iranian style. I will attempt to mention some of the traits of this new Iranian women's movement, most striking and, in my opinion, unprecedented in its global effect, not in singular examples, which we always have had, I mean, for a long time, but its broad effect, which are displayed in the Iranian society. It is worth looking at obstacles to the vision they have had, and which have served, in my view, as desperate motors to their action, to the action of women. So the feeling was something has to be done about the misery they were experiencing gradually, which were elaborated upon. They have used these motors in the most efficient and best way, and this is really absolutely fascinating. Among the obstacles and hurdles they have been experiencing, I think two major categories are visible. One is the legal, and the other one is societal ones. The legal ones are known to most of you. I hear that there are people in the audience who are all insiders to the matter, so again, not bringing water to the sea. And also working and being active in a society where women are expected to submit to the rules which have been there for a very traditional long time. So let me just, on the other hand, refer to the sources, to the resources these women have had. They have had all these obstacles. They have come to a point where they thought something needs to be done. But let us look also at the resources they had to come up with this concept, with this vision. First of all, I think it was the appearance of many like-minded peers. It was not a small group, an exclusive group of women. They were all desperate, and out of that they created energy to move on. Then, as far as I can see that, it was the family support which was given to them in their moves, mostly unconditionally, always there when they needed it, encouraging a very important backup to move on. Then was the high educational background of them. They were part and parcel, and since they had, as some naughty people say, nothing better to do after the revolution than go to universities, they had a very high knowledge of concept of sociology, of feminism elsewhere, but also they had learned lesson what would not work for Iran, the undoable concepts, the non-working ones. So a lot of insight and wisdom, and the binding element was what we call in Persian dard mushtarak, the common pain felt by everybody that something had to be done. The experience of discriminatory law, of course, was a daily sword on the head of all the women, and shaped the attitudes of the wish to change things. They knew exactly that the way they had to take, and they were ready to take, was not neither short nor easy, but they had support in the society because they had also developed excellent skill to communicate their visions and understanding in a native language to the people. So gradually the penny felt, particularly after the Khatami era, to which Dr. Tauhidi has so wonderfully alluded, the political and visibility of women came to a very high point, and actually without having parties, political parties and formations, they supported the elections and probably carried it to a great deal. This was carried by their hope that this was an opening, something would come up and to change. Because of circumstances best known to most of you, Khatami's very positive visions could not be materialized in the Iranian arena of politics, and probably the penny of which I was talking, the penny which fell in place is, okay, we cannot rely on political participation or leave it to the politicians that something has to be done, but we have to take matters in our own hands. And I think that was a very decisive and important moment. So as a Persian proverbial verse has it, nobody is going to scratch my back except for the nail of my own finger. The tactics were evolving and changing. There were demonstrations first that were badly clamped down on the streets. Gradually male peers joined in the movement and carried the movement. But women saw that the misery of being beaten up, then being put on trials like criminals was not the way it would work in the Iranian society. And wise and insightful as they are, they came up with this excellent and brilliant concept of the campaign. And by doing so, the channels of communications to women in the Iranian society, to families actually, to a broad base asset of having backup in the society, getting their inputs, talking to them for the first time actually in such a broad sense. I'm not talking about exceptions, which we have had in previous areas, but talking to people and getting their inputs. That's what we think. How about your daughter being in this position? How about yourselves coming in this position, getting their input, including them in their vision? So the popularity of this movement is much based and derives energy from this. And I think at this point I would like to say that something which is important to people like myself who do not have the privilege to live in Iran and be immediate part of it, was that the bridge was gapped between us, women in Iran, and the others. So all of a sudden the message was a common message. We felt with them, we saw that there was a chance for us to become part of it, not out of demonstrative activity, but just really feeling that this was the right way for Iran to go on. And we started to talk to people, to media, to others, to collect signatures and communicate very, very closely with media in Iran and personalities, parts of the campaign. I consider that as a very important aspect. And in order not to take too much of your time, I would like just to signalize some of the things we are doing now in the context of the election. I live in Vienna, in Austria, and a lot is going on there. For the first time, I see faces on the street coming to rallies, which usually I have met in restaurants. We have not had them as part of the anti-war campaign, as the anti-human rights executions in all the days. They are now, because it is their issue, and this is going on. Publicity work with media is going on at all possible levels. It is not as easy as, I'm not saying it's easy in the United States, but the number of the media available is more limited. But we are trying hard to to present this face of the Iranian women to the audience in Austria. Then part of us have gone on to do a PR rally with the important figures in the politics, foreign ministry in the Austrian parliament. We are seeing this development also in other countries. And the aim, our common aim, and I have contacts to Germany and mostly to Germany, France, and the UK, of which I would like to leave their report here with you for the records, to come up with a channel to the European Union, to the European Parliament, because so far we do not have a common voice there. Mahmalbov has been doing some good presentations. They're very positive, but again, the scratch of my back has to be my own. Women have to do that, and we are working on that. The site which you can all have out of this publication in the UK, it's a weblog called IranianWomenUK.com, I think. We will put it somewhere, and
we'll distribute.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what we are doing is available on a site which is a German word for that, IranianWomenToday.com.at, Austria. And in Germany, there are many other sites in different places. There are radio stations run mostly by Nasrin Basiri and her allies. There are many centers, and that's a very good news. And later in the discussion, if there are any questions, I would be happy to give answers to them. Thank you.
Jale, thank you very much. You referred briefly to the campaign. I mean, as you know, women have been arrested for participating in the campaign, and then during the presidential campaign, they showed Mrs. Kadivar, an advisor to Karoubi, signing in front of the TV and the press the campaign, and so did Ms. Rahnavar.
The 1 million signatures.
So, I mean, it changed that whole momentum and approach to the campaign. We're now going to move to Fatemeh Haqiqatjou, who was a former member of Iranian parliament, and although she's supposed to talk about the role of women in the green movement, but since on Thursday was the 10th anniversary of the student uprising at Tehran University, and she was seen as the representative of the student in parliament, and she was mostly with them while Mr. Khatami had disappeared completely those days. So it would be nice, maybe in the Q&A, we could go back and compare the events to you. So Fatemeh, please.
Thank you very much. Before I begin my talk, I would like to thank the Wilson Center and especially Dr. Hales Fanyari for this great panel. I would like to thank all of you for your support in these days. The Iranian people need your help and support. Your solidarity with them allows their voice to be heard and to pressure Iran's supreme leader to stop violating their rights. I would like to begin my talk regarding women in Iran's green movement. Women are agents of change in Iran, and they have particularly influence in any election through their vote. This was seen for the first time in presidential election of 1997, when Mohammad Khatami was able to attract women's vote using his campaign slogans, which promised to improve women's situation in the country and to respect them. Then women acted not merely as voters, but also as a candidate at the first municipal councils and succeeded in gaining a great number of seats at the election, 16% of all seats, a landslide considering past result. During the reform movement, certain restrictions against women were relaxed. However, since then, during the post-reform movement, Ahmadinejad presidency, when women have been faced with more challenges in the social arena. Every day they face the disrespectful actions of moral police who stop random women on the street to harass them about their hairs, makeups, scarves, and other clothing, and some women are even arrested for perceived infraction of Iran's Islamic dress code. Any gathering or rally is subject to harsh crackdowns by the Revolutionary Guard. And the parliament, instead of changing discriminatory laws, has passed many patriarchal ones, which only serve to infringe upon women's sense of freedom and equality. As if all this were not enough, the female member of 7th Parliament have spoken out against women's rights. For instance, Ms. Ishrat Shaiq said, referring to female runaway and prostitutes, if we execute 10 of these street women, we will no longer face this issue. She added that women have no value without their families. Also, women's rights activists have been facing intimidation, detention, and prosecution. All of the hardship that women have faced have had the effect of simultaneously increasing their awareness of their own lack of social, political, and legal rights, while creating an atmosphere of gender equality through the important role that women have played in the Green Movement. A coalition of women's activists even called for changing the constitution to ensure gender equality. All presidential candidates, excluding Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, promised to promote and elevate the status of women in Iran, giving greater opportunity to women to be involved in public policy decision-making and changing discriminatory laws. The starting point was the set of Mir Hossein Mousavi's campaign promises, which were made alongside with his wife, Professor Zahra Rahnavard. Just as I mentioned, when Mir Hossein Mousavi became Prime Minister of Iran, his wife was so well known that some of politicians would say Zahra Rahnavard's husband became Prime Minister of Iran. These promises attract many young women who are seeing change in Iran. Ziabari believes that Rahnavard created a vigorous enthusiasm and zealousness among the young women in Iran. Many believe Rahnavard has become a symbol for the women's rights movement. Women were energized by promises from some candidate for more gender equality. They are fighting at this very moment to create a better future for their children. During the week leading up to the 2009 presidential election, the street and alleys of Iran's major cities were filled with young women. Iranian young women supported reformists not only to show their hatred of Ahmadinejad's misogynist policies and his government social restriction on women's appearance in the public sphere, but also to seek social, economical, political, and legal reform. The Green Wave encompasses the whole country. After Mr. Mousavi received the news of fraudulent vote count in favor of Ahmadinejad on the day of the election, he announced his victory and said that anything other than this is a lie and a fraud. Just as he predicted, Ahmadinejad claimed that to be the winner, which is an electoral coup d'etat. Immediately, the security and military forces arrested a number of reformist leaders, including many female political activists and journalists. In response, Mr. Mousavi and Mr. Karoubi have protested and called on the people for a continuation of their protest on a street to demand the government annul the election and hold a new election. Mr. Mousavi declared that protesting to lies and fraud is your right. He states the ultimate goal of the election fraud is not just to impose an administration that people do not want. It imposes a new political life on the country. Iranian women take to the street as an agent of resistance. Aside from women's activist role during the election campaign, they have been in front of lines of protest and resistance. They pour onto the streets. They fight with police and the besieged with stones. They have been killed, detained, arrested, and prosecuted. They have gained a sense of courage and inspire men to continue with their resistance. Women protested at first to request an annulment of the election and re-election, then to say that Ahmadinejad is not our president. One of the protesters told to CNN, this regime is against all humanity, more especially against all women. Many men say that we men are not able to do anything. Maybe these women would be able to bring freedom back to the country. In addition, women are agents of courage because of this militarized situation in the country, and they try to terrorize the atmosphere. They inspire their family to continue their protests. However, Khadija Moqaddam, a women's rights activist, said to Rose Online, despite the fact that women were not passive supporters and they have been in front line to defend their right, some male protesters chanted that bighayrat men have not joined us while women have joined us. That was because of the patriarchal culture. That means you see the mix analyzed from the people inside Iran. Something, the women will bring freedom back to the country, and some, they said this. So they have been protest since June 12, despite the heavy militarization situation. Especially people protested on the July 9, and this is so important because the government would thinking after arresting, killing people, and terrorizing the situation, women will be people will be afraid and not to come to the street. But on July 9, the 10th anniversary of the 18th attack on Tehran University dormitory, thousands of people held a rally to commemorate that day. I've heard that because people demonstrated all street on the Tehran. Some estimated even if we counted all of those, a small demonstration would be rise to 1 million. I don't know exactly. On this day, women played an important role by making a show of resistance in front of the police, protecting young men against capture by the police. They chanted, "Here is our land, our city, our sidewalk, and we won't live here. You should live here." Women of all ages resisted, especially old women. They played a leading role through their resistance in keeping the Green movement alive. So women have been agents of resistance in the country. Women have many initiatives to keep the movement on the street. One, this initiative is the Morning Mothers. I don't want to go in detail because Nayera explained that. Many of another initiative, what was the they choose Lale Park because this park is close to location where Neda was killed. Many of them have been around the Evin prison to protest and request to release their family of whom have been detained aftermath of the election. In addition, another group of women titled Peace Mothers have been communicating with the Human Rights Unit and Citizenship Rights Center of the judiciary system and the minor fraction of the 8th Parliament to follow up situation of political prisoners who have been detained aftermath of the election fraud unrest. Why women are the front line of the movement? One of the characteristics of the Green movement is the fact that women play a crucial role in the front line. The main reason for this is that they have been faced with many restrictions and a general disregard for their social rights. Mehrangiz Kar says to me, women have learned how to face the government agent that restrict their social rights, such as the dress code condition. Also, they have learned the weak aspect of the regime. So through social channels, they have gained political experience. This regime restricts social freedom more than anything. Particularly, Ahmadinejad government's radicalism forces more restriction on women. Therefore, to end this radicalism, women have engaged at the election campaign and post-election protests. Women have found out that they are not alone in this experience, and many of them have been disrespected. They are all seek to change this unbearable situation peacefully through their vote. So they were excited and actively campaigning. Then when they saw that their voices stolen by the government, instead of losing hope and sitting at the home, they went out onto the streets to demand their vote be counted. When the militia cracked on the protesters, they even acted aggressively to release their fellow Iranian from the hand of military. Through this new experience, they found a sense of courage by acting with a collective spirit. They chanted, "Do not be afraid, do not be afraid. We are all in this together." Women do not seem to give up. Iranian women are very powerful and they want their freedom. And my last point, which is this letter affected me, Iran's leader think they can successfully control the country through a government brought to power by the coup d'etat, but they have never been more wrong. A young Iranian woman in a letter cited by Roger Cohen wrote, "I will participate in the demonstration tomorrow. Maybe they will turn violent. Maybe I will be one of the people who is going to be killed. I am listening to all my favorite music. I wrote these random sentences for the next generation so that they know we are not just emotional under peer pressure. So they know that we did everything we could to create a better future for them. So they know that our ancestors surrendered to Arab and Mongol, but did not surrender to despotism. This note is dedicated to tomorrow's children."
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fatima. Ms. Rahnavard's husband was asked how come he chose the green color for his campaign. And he said it was quite accidental. I was in the provinces giving a talk, and a young man came and put a green shawl around my shoulders. And I thought, wow, it looks nice, and I'm an artist, and I decided this is a nice color to be the color of the campaign. So that's where we stand with the green movement, because I noticed both Norma and Nayere were wearing the green bracelet, and you are wearing a green scarf. Sure. Okay, we move on now to Norma Moruzi, who's Associate Professor of Political Science and Gender and Women's Studies and History at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Norma and I were together in Tehran, where Norma conducted talk at a workshop at Tehran University, and I must say, when the teaching was over and she was going back home, both the very conservative students and the less conservative students came up to her with different kind of present. The conservative students, I think, as I recall, gave you an Nahj al-Balagha, correct? Yes, the saying of Ali. And the not so conservative students, I think, gave you a book on Iran. Was that so? So, okay. Norma, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here today, and to Hale for organizing the panel, and also to my fellow panelists who've provided already so much background. So I hope that what I say both complements some of what they're saying and maybe adds to it as well. The experience I've had, I've been able to go back and forth to Iran basically since 1997. And although the last time I was there was 2 years ago, which is the longest I haven't been back over that period. And in that time, I've been able to do my own research, but also, as Hale mentioned, to teach and to conduct workshops and to basically work with an informal network of individuals engaged in various kinds of diverse efforts for social and political change, mostly women, although not entirely, and made up of activists, faculty members, students, journalists, editors, researchers, other people, sort of a broad network. A lot of these are young. I mean, as you probably know, it's a very young population, but by no means all of them. And what I want to emphasize is I cannot emphasize enough what my fellow panelists have already said, which is that women's participation in both, as you've seen in the last month, is fully engaged, is half the population, is out there visibly. I've talked to people who've come back within the last week, who've been involved in protests, and they too say that it's 50-50. I mean, this is a broad-based popular movement. So that it cuts across gender lines, it cuts across age lines, it cuts across class lines. That's very important. It cuts across regional lines. And actually, a feminist writing in one of the feminist websites, in Iran, taking sort of questions from inside Iran, but others, was asked, well, why aren't you talking right now about feminist issues? And she said that her response was that these are common issues. Right now, this is a common struggle. These are common issues. So I think that's really important, and that it's very important for us today to focus on women's specific participation, but also to recognize that this is about a common project that's been building for a long time, both in terms of what's really emerged with the election, and if there's one truly positive thing that has happened in the last month, along with a number of things that are very difficult, although some of them are more encouraging, I think it's that especially for a U.S. audience, the image of Iran that really had been characterized by the memories of not even particularly the revolution, but especially the hostage crisis, has been replaced by something else. There are issues with this too, because an awful lot of the public imagery, especially here, has really been focused on young, chic, upper middle class Iranians in North Tehran. That's positive in the sense it's helped Americans realize not everybody is wearing a full black chador with almost their entire face covered, yelling down to America. But I think that it's also important to note a lot of the other images that have come out in various websites and various other places that show that this is not just a youth movement, this is not just a women's movement, this is not just a secular movement, this is really a mixed movement, and that's its strength. So what I thought that I would like to address is a little bit about where that comes from. because for those of us who have had the ability to go back and forth for a number of years, in certain ways this is not a surprise. What I've said for years about Iran is that it's always short-term, immediate crisis, blockage, kind of really immediate crisis, long-term optimism. And this is true. I actually was in Iran 10 years ago during Hibdatir, during those demonstrations. It was the same thing then, in a way. I mean, it was this sense of just crisis. I mean, real crisis, death at the university, these attacks. I mean, there was this huge, it was a huge uprising, but it was really limited to students. So it was a limited uprising. It didn't particularly have a focused agenda. And in that sense, it was much easier to control, and it was very drastically and violently controlled. But even then, I remember having discussions with people heavily involved with what was going on. There was this sense of immediate blockage, crisis, long-term optimism. And I was wondering if that was the case these days, because in some ways this is a much, much bigger movement, much more entrenched, much more organic, but also it's been much more violently and explicitly repressed. And then about a week ago, I talked with a friend and colleague who'd just come back, and I didn't ask him this, but he said, "I'm so optimistic." I was like, what? 20 people have died at least, whatever. But he said, no, what you feel, everybody is so energized. People are also depressed and frustrated and cynical, but they feel a kind of recurrence of what happened the first time Khatami was elected. And what happened at that point was that there had not been any really effective polls that had been done. There, people knew what they thought, what their friends thought, what their family thought, but there was this kind of general statement, well, that's just us, and the rest of them out there, who knows, they're probably going along. And then there was this overwhelming vote for Khatami. And part of what it did is it taught the population that they were a collective, okay? And a collective that had voted for change and had voted for something new. For the period under the reformists, they were very accurate polls that were done, public polls that were done that really showed already in the 90s that there was actually much more cohesion among the population, much more skepticism about what I would call religious rigidity, not necessarily religion, much more a kind of broad-based similarity of responses to polls about morality, polls about political attitudes across regions, across cities, between rural and urban communities. I mean, really a kind of national cohesiveness that surprised people. But of course, that got closed down along with the sort of the pressure on the reformists, the end of Khatami's second term, the election of Ahmadinejad. Public polling agencies were closed down, and this kind of information really was not available anymore. So that up until a month before the election, again, there was this sort of set of questions. Oh, well, I know what I think, what my friends think. And again, this is across lines among religious, among secular. And I would say at this point in Iran, it's less important to say. The distinction is, for instance, perhaps between secular and reformist, who are in an alliance, and not Islamists, but in hardline members of the regime. That this has actually been characterized by people coming out and people inside as this is not Islamists versus seculars, or this is a very narrowed aspect of the government against everybody else. But why is this? Where does this come from? I mean, how is it that women have been part of this? Women have been part of ongoing public life in Iran now. I mean, in a way, we can almost argue, and I would in some ways argue, for 30 years. And I don't want to repeat things that people know, but one thing that always strikes me as very important is to remember the difference in Iran between material social conditions and legal conditions. And especially for women, this is crucial, because women are clearly second-class legal citizens in Iran. Okay, their testimony is worth half of a man's. Their inheritance rights and custody rights are different, et cetera, et cetera. The age of marriage is 9. All these things that everybody hears and thinks is so appalling. But then it's very, very, very important to compare what are actually the material social conditions for women. And for instance, although the legal age of marriage for women is 9, the mean age of marriage is now 24. So in fact, the legal age of marriage here is whatever, but we know that there are unfortunately lots of young girls who are having sex too early, etc. I mean, you know, but in Iran, I think people tend to forget that and assume that all these little children are being married off. What we know is that it's happening to some extent, but in fact, it's not nearly by any chance a common factor anymore. And this has to do with social issues, but also administrative issues in terms of encouraging older age of marriage for women as well as men. So mid-20s by now. And what I like to do, too, to emphasize how this has happened, both from, I mean, I titled my talk just generally Quiet Leadership and Pressure from Below. These changes, social changes and political reforms, have come from women pushing within the system, and that means women from different political spectrums, including Islamist women from the early days of the Islamic Republic, but also from the sort of schizophrenic nature of the Islamic Republic itself, which meant that right after the revolution, on the one hand, there were efforts to impose a more patriarchal form of legal strictures on women, more repressive family codes, etc. But there were also parts of the Republican tendency to provide education and health care to all aspects of the population, and that also meant women. So education became mandatory and free for both boys and girls. And I like to back this up to quote statistics, although I usually am not a statistics kind of person, but I know that they made a big impression on me, and I think that they're important to take note of, that in 1980, the majority of Iranians were illiterate. Only 49% of Iranians were literate, and 60% of Iranian men were literate, and only 38% of women were literate. So not only do you have a very high illiteracy rate, but you have a big gap between male and female rates of literacy, which is always very indicative of one of those key indicators of gender status. You know, not just literacy rate, but the division between the genders. By 2000, not only are 75% of all Iranians literate, but it's 83% of men, 70% of women. And in the key cohort of 24 years of age and under, which means the generation that's been raised as opposed to trying to actually teach adult literacy classes catching up, it's 94% of the country is literate, 96% of men, 92% of women. So you have essentially close to full literacy and very little distinction in the gender gap between men and women. And I've mentioned the mean age of marriage, and others have mentioned, for instance, the fertility rate, which was in 1972 it was 2.7, 1977 it was 2.7, 1987 it had one of the highest spikes in the world, so it was 3.9, and then Iran had one of the most successful family planning policies in the world, supported fully by the government and the clergy, so that if it's now, in 1997 it was 1.5, and I think it's lower than that now. And these kind of material status indicators are really key because they help explain why women are in a position to be part of public life, including political life. They're healthy, they're literate, they're educated, and they're accepted at all levels of the society now to be part of public life. Now, whether that means that actually all levels of society agree that they should be president is a different issue. But of course, that's a different issue here too, as well as we, as we recognize. But whether or not women are accepted to be on the street, in the workforce, in school, that's not a question anymore. And on occasion, 2 years ago, a very conservative cleric came out with a statement basically saying, yeah, women should go back home. It was considered practically a joke and a sort of eccentric absurdity. Okay, this is a consensus now across broad swathes of the population. Again, across class lines, across age lines, that women are part of public life, and that's meant that when this sudden emergence of the public protests a month ago, it was very natural for women to be out there as well, out in the streets, and then after the protests, the clampdown on the protests, to be very active in some of these more informal and private protests. And I've had, again, sort of talking to friends who are there or who've just come back, that often it's women in the families who've really pushed for the rooftop chanting at night, to getting everybody organized and up onto the roof and shouting Allah Akbar. It's women who've been very much present, if not as visible leadership, although some of them have been, but very much active in protests, sort of as a kind of complement to the quote that Fatima read at the end by that young student. Again, a friend who just come back quoted a student who was protesting next to him, who was describing to her fellow marchers in one of the protests about 2 weeks ago about how in a previous march she'd been beaten up and thrown to the ground and had a very bad experience, and she'd actually gone to the Swiss embassy, had in fact received political asylum, and had been planning to leave Iran. In the protest, she was saying, I swore, I said, that's it, I'm not going to protest anymore, I won't do it, and there she was, actually in the street. So on the one hand, someone stating, I'm going to go out there. On the other hand, had someone who's actually in the street saying, well, I decided I wasn't, but here I am. You know, that. So this is something that is almost transcending, pushing people despite themselves, perhaps despite their fears, despite their hesitations. And let me just, I know I want to wrap up, not go too long, but emphasize again also what's been said is that part of what has really structured women's participation at the informal sector, they're out there in the street protests. But perhaps even more importantly is that over the last a number of years, especially the last 2 years, there's been formal efforts at coalition building amongst secular and reformist feminists. And this has been incredibly important and is really unique. It doesn't exist among student groups. It doesn't exist among intellectual groups. There are secular and reformist groups that work with each other, have contact with each other, but there has been no effective effort at coalition building except among the women's movement. And this has been going on for it's been going on for years, but at least the last 2 years, so that the ability that they had to pull together and combine a common platform for the campaign, to interview representatives of the various politicians and grill them about their platform on women as a collective front was tremendously important. And again, this pressed the candidates to clarify their position and to come out more strongly, because they recognized that they had a constituency out there. Both Karoubi, who initially was sort of considered perhaps more feminist friendly, but then in fact some of the representatives from this women's coalition endorsed that in fact Mousavi's eventual platform was in fact they thought more friendly. So I don't want to nitpick between the candidates, but that they had to respond to this, and they did respond across the board. But that goes back farther, already to 2001, just to bring out again that this is a long ongoing process, and that's why some of us feel more optimistic despite constant immediate crisis. For instance, when in 2001, for the fourth development plan under at that point, the reformist parliament, a coalition of, at that point, what we might call reformist feminists, including Zahra Ranavard, put together a report on women's conditions that was submitted to the Majlis, to the planning board, and was incorporated in the development plan, and was clearly based on these women's recommendation, which they titled at that point a report on gender justice. And I think, again, that's important, because for us in the U.S., and often we look for instance, gender equality, which is the phrase that tends to get used here. But they specifically chose a different phrase, not because they wanted to necessarily reject equality, but they wanted to use a phrase that would have weight within the context of Iran. And justice has a very strong is a very strong term within the Islamic framework. Okay, for a lot of people, the moral sense of Islam is about justice, is social justice. So gender justice was an effective term for putting together both a platform, a coalition, and for an effective presence to push for certain kind of reforms even within the system, within the political and policy system, as well as from outside. And so it's that kind of ongoing activity, and then within the last few years, actually the collaboration between various groups that has been really important and has in fact resulted within what we now are seeing, which is the kind of emergence of a very, very, very broad-based, widespread movement, including women, among women, but also including men, women, all aspects of the population.
Norma, thank you very much. Really, this was putting everything into perspective.
Well, we're all adding up here.
Exactly. Now we move to Paris Esfandiari, who is the founder and president, Eclectic Women Iran Docht. I at least every morning I just go on her site and to see what's the latest about women's issues. Paris, you have the floor.
Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to thank you, Wilson Center, and specifically Khaled for making it possible. And also the panel, the presentation were very informative and very interesting. Thank you. And also every one of you for your interest and for being here. Now about Iranian women. During the past week, as the uprising in Iran continued to unfold in front of the watchful gaze of the world, a Hollywood production titled Stoning of Soraya opened on the big screen. Depicting Iranian women as voiceless victims of their husbands, their communities, and the authorities. This film's powerful images of a woman being stoned to death were screened in front of a packed house. At the same time, our TV news reports relayed real-life images from Iran of women as street fighters, chasing revolutionary guards, kicking them, and yes, throwing stones at them. Talk of ironic. And I'd like you to look at these pictures. We also saw the symbol of the uprising, not an old Ayatollah, but a young woman, a philosophy student, Neda. So what are we to make of all these images? Who is the Iranian woman? Where does she fit in the world? What is the nature of her power? Who represents her? And how? Through what kind of media? What kind of politics? And what kind of audiences? What kind of culture? And how does she produce her own image? It is with these questions in mind that I launched Iran Dokht in 2002 as an online media platform to connect the global community to Iranian women. To explain how we covered the election, I will divide my talk into 6 sections. Women as political figures, women coalitions, women as voters and demonstrators, international support, communication and internet, and finally art and popular culture. It is a lot, but I will go through it very quickly, and if there are questions and answers, then during this session we can respond. But first, a brief introduction on Iran Dokht, my electronic bridge to Iran. Our coverage began few months prior to June 12 as election dominated the news. As a reporter, I knew what is hot. But I think we all were surprised by how hot things got. There were few incidents of bombing and unrest here and there, and we reported those. But that was nothing compared to the political bombs that the candidates began to throw at one another. As a non-partisan outlet, I resisted pressure to side and to support one candidate over the other. That's not my job. We simply covered all campaigns at best we could. On June 13, when the world woke up to the news of an alleged coup in Iran, we remained non-partisan, reporting the news as they unfolded. My job, get the facts. We covered the confusion and then mass demonstration that surprised many. I was not surprised. During election campaigns, a collective identity was formed, and Iranian people reclaimed the public space. The green chain, that, honking, rowdiness, it was going on. So it was quite predictable that they would not give it up easily. At first, demonstrations were exciting for people. Then events turned nasty. There was beating, crackdown, and arrests. At this point, Iran Dokht's position was clear. siding with people's right to peaceful demonstrations. Now let's get to the election. First, women as political leaders. Election saga began with news about who was registering for candidacy. Naturally, we raised the question of women. Does our constitution allow for a woman to become a president? Of course, this debate was not new. We did present this 4 years ago. Everyone thought it was far-reaching, but the idea is not to have a female president at this point, but to break the taboo, to ignite a chain of events that enhances Iranian women's position. At the same time, our editorial covered the views expressed by Supreme Leader, Guardian Council, key female parliamentarians, and other influential figures on the female candidacy and presidency. For example, recently, Supreme Leader said there's no reason why women could not be president. Eventually, 450 Iranian, including 42 women, registered as prospective candidates. We began to raise the question of who are these women? Why did they register, knowing they would not be approved? It was interesting to note that some of these women's outlook were not quite what authorities want to see. Indeed, since Revolution of 1979, a huge segment of society, the secular group, has been silenced and made invisible. Now, 30 years later, here she was, daring enough to nominate herself for presidency. We highlighted this irony. This is another person registered. On May 17, 4 candidates were approved and put forward to people. It was interesting to note that each camp had a first lady. I also arranged interviews with potential first ladies. We compared their background and discussed their position on women issues. I also arranged interviews with potential first ladies. On June 12, I interviewed Jamile Kadibar, First Lady of Reformist candidate Karoubi. She is an opinionated politician and journalist with a strong voice. She was in charge of women affairs for Karoubi and was promised a ministerial position. I spoke to her on Friday, June 12. She voted that morning. We spoke about the election, its possible outcome. I asked her about her possible ministerial position. She confirmed it. We talked about Baha'is' faith followers in Iran. She emphasized their rights as citizens and acknowledged that this has been violated in past. I even asked her how the winner would be able to bring together this divided nation. She was hopeful. She also expressed some concern about vote counting procedure. She was clearly alarmed, but hopeful for the future. Well, as we all know, few hours later, things changed. The first day after election dispute, women politicians were present in demonstration and gave talk, but soon that changed because government announced demonstrations illegal. Also, Faize Rafsanjani, daughter of Ayatollah Rafsanjani, were arrested a day after she appeared in demonstration and gave a talk. She was released later. My sources were in the process of arranging an interview with Zahra Rahnavard, wife of Mr. Mousavi, for the week after election. With the unfolding events, it did not happen. I even could not reach my contacts. Later, I learned that they were arrested. So I now move to another topic that we covered, and that is women coalition. I knew that Nayera talked about it in length, and also Norma referred to it. It was one of the most interesting events that happened in this time. And it brought together many women with very different objectives and point of views. Our editorial followed this development and emphasized its importance. Particularly interesting was participation of professional organizations that usually attract those who either do not want to be politically active or are not allowed by authorities, or both. We made sure that these voices were heard, because indeed over the last 30 years we hardly heard these voices, and this was one of the achievements of coalition. Since this has been already talked, so I would not go through it, time is limited, so I will look at women as voters and during uprising and demonstration. I wanted to mobilize women to participate in election. We provided articles about women's role in previous elections and its outcome. I interviewed Christian Amanpour after her return from Iran. I asked about her interview of Ahmadinejad and if it was possible for West to have a dialogue with him. She emphasized the importance of dialogue and thought it was feasible. I asked about the women and election, and she emphasized their critical role as voters. During election rallies, women had very strong presence, and we showed that. News indicated that women who participated in election rallies were not particularly concerned with women's rights. We published articles on the impact of future presidents' policies on their daily lives. After election dispute, reporting became hard. Western journalists were arrested or warned to stay in their hotels. Opposition media inside the country was stopped. Some journalists were arrested. Some of our sources inside the country were not able to work. We have to rely on citizen journalism. At this point, we were receiving huge amount of images, videos, reports, and stories of what happened to them during demonstration via emails and text messages. I carefully selected news, marking them as unverified. Then cell phones had no receptions and internet was made slow and almost inaccessible in Iran. Our sources in Iran had to rely on telephone to tell their stories. But soon telephone connection with outside the country were almost impossible. So at this point, it was hard to get the news on a regular basis. We had to be creative. I complemented what I was receiving from inside with Iran's government-controlled news sources. Nevertheless, we managed to cover the story as it was unfolding. We showed the strong presence of women both in election rallies and dispute. We showed the diversity. We showed women shoulder to shoulder with their men in both camps. We showed fearless young women as they fought, chased and kicked authorities. We showed how authorities beat these women as hard as they beat men. They acted and were treated as equals, and we showed that. Indeed, in this uprising, Iranian women reclaimed their image, and we did our best to show it to the world. These are the diversity of the women. And you can see there are different ages, they're different. Each camp attracted both modern and traditional. They were beaten equally, escaping from the events. And by June 12th, the uprising had its own fallen hero, Neda, and I wrote an article next day to separate facts from fiction. Her death angered people inside and indeed around the world. Iranian authorities understand the power of Shia's mourning cycle. They exploited it masterfully during Iran's 1979 revolution. So it was not surprising that they banned public from attending Neda's funeral. We showed it. Next section I would like to focus is global community. Iranian voters for the first time, the candidates showed interest in votes outside the country. We tried to mobilize our audiences by pointing out that the election was tight and that their vote mattered. Remaining non-partisan, we highlighted the importance of this election at this junction of the history from many angles. We also announced the voting places around the world in our website with dates and time of operation and how to get there. As demonstration inside became increasingly dangerous and violent, the support poured from outside. Iranians all around the world gathered and raised their voice. The most interesting thing about an online internet media is its ability to connect to all parts of the world. So it was not surprising that events from every corner of the world, Japan, Sweden, New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Washington, Los Angeles, were posted in Iran Ducht. We tried to inform and mobilize people. We also received pictures and reports of these events, and we made sure these are shown to the people. This still is going on. The latest is a gathering organized for July 25th in North California and is expected to attract 25,000 people. There was also support from international community. Prague was the one to start it. A large number of people gathered in support of Iran's Green Movement. They posted their events in our website and we received pictures of their gathering. So we showed this. There were more to come and we promoted them. There was also huge support by human rights activists around the world. Campaigns to collect signatures in support of demonstrators, dispute of election, freedom of those arrested. We tapped into it, displayed this and distributed and engaged people with this. The next section I would like to focus is communication and internet. Our coverage of election indicated that 3 minutes.
Okay.
I will go fast. Our coverage of election indicated that from very beginning this campaign was different from the past. It was unusually open, communication sensitive and tech savvy. There were several interesting elements. There was debates. This was new to Iranian society. We showed the public debate between candidates in our website. These were very new for Iranian audiences. Ahmadinejad stood up using his usual outrageous and controversial style that have served him well in past. In my interview with Kadivar, she criticized Ahmadinejad's literature, especially the unproven corruption charges he made. She thought it could set a very low standard and indeed promote a culture of unfounded accusation. All candidates, knowing their crowd are young and web-savvy, made a very good use of internet, including blogs, Facebook pages, YouTube, and other sources. One candidate stood up. That was Mousavi. His use of color green as a symbol. His image of holding hands with his wife. His wife's use of color in her outfit. All in all indicated a mastery of image building combined with technology. We covered it and our youth loved it. We covered the nights before election as people's energy was building up. Indeed, Tehran did not sleep 2 nights leading to the election. Crowds were in the street holding whole night, chanting and dancing. We made sure that the world saw this. For Iran's young population, this was particularly exciting. 13 years old female, Daria Kul from Tehran, wrote at Iran Ducht's forum, "I love Iran. We were out all night. We screamed, hold hands with our friends. We even danced in the streets." For many, this freedom was surreal. In post-election period, it was not surprising to see how Iranians use the modern communication system to their advantage. They're young, educated, and web-savvy. We were receiving messages and YouTube links, reports that were sent via email, through cell phones, social networks, Yahoo groups, Twitter, and many more. And we made sure that out of this mass of data, we select reliable information and present it clutter-free to the world. This is the last part. I will be very quick. Sorry. The last part I like to cover is art and popular culture. It's very revealing of public mood, and at Iran Ducht, I pay special attention to this. During election campaigns, the pop culture was fun, energetic, and vibrant. There were colorful slogans on walls everywhere, and we showed them. Chanting was hopeful and energizing. We reported on that. Green Camp's color tapped into people's creative energy and therefore stood up in campaign. Women used it in their outfit and makeup. We showed women with green nails, another with writing on her palms. Someone else painted her face with green lines. However, as soon as authorities attacked people, the mood changed. We received huge amount of artwork from artists around the world expressing their anger. Iran is at a very critical point in its history. Indeed, history is unfolding. So far, the uprising has produced a very vibrant and positive social movement, but it is young and fragile. There are internal problems in the country that could be manipulated to produce negative outcomes. There are also foreign threats. At Iran Ducht, I could not publish emotional and reactionary responses that could create negative reaction, so I became extra vigilant. For example, July 8, there was demonstrations in Tabriz. Few shouted chants that could promote ethnic clashes. So our editorial raised the alarm. Caricature is also very effective. We received these caricatures. I did not publish these as I find them partisan or reactionary, but this made its way to our website. Why? Because it's not about Ahmadinejad or Mustafi. Here, artist is questioning the concept of dictatorship, and in his anger demolishes the foundation of dictatorship. Music was another area. We were using some of the classical national songs, mainly by Shajarian from Iran 1979 revolution. But as soon as attack on demonstrations started, artists around the world expressed their feeling through their music and lyrics. We selectively displayed this. We showcased U2's concert in Spain. Bono sang Bloody Sunday as Farsi lyrics were dropped on a green curtain behind him. I want to finish my talk by pointing out that today green has moved beyond Mousavi's campaign. It is now the color of uprising. An uprising that's grassroots, organic, colorful, fluid, and persistence. All female characteristics. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you very much. We are now opening the panel to question, comments, and then, yes, please, could you wait for the mic and identify yourself? The mic is coming. That's right. And if we have question in the overflow, could you please send it down? Yes. I think it's easier if you pass it through the middle. No,
Chia Chen, freelance correspondence, and thank you for coming. You all make a very excellent presentation, and it's quite informative and educational. If I pronounce your name wrong, please forgive me. Yeah. First, Dr. Nayar Tohidi. This is quite involved, and you talk about the economy and foreign policy, religion, culture, tradition, and even for the future of Iran. Just related to the election, each politician have to catch the national mood. I would like to know what's the message in the four candidates, and the particular dealing with the nature of the movement. And second is to the Dr. Jared Lecton Gohena. What's the treatment of the Iran in Austria particular and in Europe general? And for Dr. Fatik
Sure.
why do you resign from the parliament? Would you remain inside and fight from the parliament will more benefit to the movement? And also this will be for everybody. For the future, will you cultivate and encourage women to get elect in the
I think
in
I'll
the parliament?
stop you here
Okay,
because
thank
it
you.
was what you each get one question. Nayere,
If I understood you correctly, you were asking me what messages each candidate had with regard to those three sets of issues I talked about. That is the economy, foreign policy, and social, cultural, civil rights, right? If that's the question, well, just to put it briefly, I think the message of two reformist candidates, that is Mousavi and Karoubi, with regard to economy was to stop the mismanagement of the economy by Ahmadinejad, this populistic, just giving away all these bonuses of the huge oil money. You know, during his administration, Iran had the highest amount of income through oil because it reached the price of $150 a barrel. So, but he, according to statistics given by the National Bank and by many non-partisan sources in Iran, he really did not invest that money in productive sector of economy, but he gave away a lot of that money and increased inflation and all that. So according to Mousavi and the debates they had, and Karoubi and even Mohsen Rezai, the main argument against Ahmadinejad was the mismanagement of the economy and also foreign policy. I believe had the other candidates won, especially Mousavi and Karoubi, they were going to stop all this hostile, belligerent attitude of Ahmadinejad against the West, especially this denial of Holocaust. All those things were going to stop. So the message was, we don't want confrontation with the West. We want to have a normal relationship. So if Mousavi had won, or even Karoubi, they were going to start the process of normalization of relationship with the United States and with other countries, and stop that wrong and misled foreign policy. With regard to social issues, again, these were ideas that these presidents were, of course, promising. How much they could really implement is another question. I'm not saying that if Mousavi had won or if Karoubi, they could really implement all these policies, but at least as president and the amount of power that the president in Iran has, which is limited but still significant, they would have pursued different policy with regard to economy, with regard to foreign policy, and also especially with regard to social issues and this onslaught on civil rights that Ahmadinejad increased would have changed. And also with regard to women, because the message Ahmadinejad has given, we have already seen. He increased the pressure on women. He proposed a bill for reinforcement of polygamy. He, even after the so-called victory of him during a press conference, when he was asked by a reporter, what would you do in your second term for women's rights to improve it? He said, well, women actually have more rights in Iran than men do. They are just mistaking by pushing for some changes because they don't realize actually they may work against them. So he really outraged many women by saying that. So that was his message, but the other ones, at least in their messages, were more promising and more moderate and more reformist.
Anybody else want to
من بودم
answer?
3 سال از خانم گوهری بود بعد من.
آره، حالا شما
Okay,
جواب بدید
okay,
تو
sure.
خانم گوهری نفهمیدن اصلا تو فهمیدی.
Okay,
جواب.
okay. Your question was why I resigned from the parliament. You know, if I mentioned to Musavi's last point that the ultimate goal of the election fraud is not just to impose an administration that people do not want. It imposes a new political life on the country. This new political life on the country was started at least a while ago, since exactly started for the first time this, you know, changing the election result was started first with the expediency majlis, expert majlis, majlis khubregan, council, okay, which is they converted representative, and then they try to do it same as for parliament, which is when I was in parliament for the 7th parliament election, they disqualified, the Guardian Council disqualified more than 2,000 people in the country, including 80 members of the parliament. And my colleagues and I protested, had almost a month sitting to protest for this method of the country. And so I resigned at that time for showing our protest, and we was disqualified for the next election. This was the main reason that at this presidential election exactly, this wasn't just a you know, sort of fraud in the election, which we had a minor change at any election, and this was converting the result of the election. Mr. Musavi was elected. I think he is the real truthful president of the country, and Ahmadinejad did a coup d'etat against the thoughtful elected president, and this is a trend, and this is a method, and that resignation, it was a sort of protest for this issue. Although these days I was hoping, I wish I was a member of parliament in 8th election, at least for bringing president to the parliament, the interior minister to parliament, and questioning them regarding current situation.
Okay, Johnny, you want to?
I hope I will refer correctly to your question. What we are doing and why we are doing what we are doing in Europe is with a non-idealistic concept that it was important and still is important to get one step out of the dogmatic system which is deciding on the fate of Iranians and particularly on women. So the other thing is we want to discuss and put emphasis on the female face of what is happening in Iran, of the elections, which has been excessively discussed. I don't need to reiterate on that. And it is important to see also this scripture, the female face of the movement, also in what the young people are doing. But also that was discussed. It's a feminine style and effective and long-term thinking concept. What I missed to say, and I would like, if I may, just with one word added, somebody talked on the panel of the 25th of July. It is a proclaimed day of protests worldwide. This has been signed by many important people of the world, one of which is our Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Prize laureate, and all along in Europe, and I think not exclusively in Europe, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's an international.
Yeah.
All human rights organizations also have called for it.
A scroll is being prepared saying that he is not our president. This scroll is going to be displayed on the Eiffel Tower on this day in Paris, and we are all participating in that. The other thing is to put the image, not the shot one, the beautiful image which Paris showed of Neda on the main squares of European cities. This is happening on the Rathaus municipality of Paris, and also the town hall of Paris, and also on that day in Vienna. Things like that to show the female face of the events in Iran.
So Dreyfus, yes, you. Just could you wait for the Mona? Where is the mic? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob Dreyfus with The Nation magazine. I was in Iran for the elections, and I also contribute to this new blog or website called Tehran Bureau, which is founded by a woman you may know, Golnoush Niknishad. I saw for myself when I was there the role of women in the campaign and the election and the protests afterwards, and so there's no denying what you all have reported. And I don't mean to take anything away from that, but I want to talk about what happens now, because many of you have said, okay, this is a movement which in the long term is going to mean something, but my own view as a journalist is in the short term it doesn't mean anything. I think these guys are in power for the next 4 years at least, with a rock-hard grip on power. So my question is, I want you to comment a little bit about what you think happens now, but also maybe from this specific standpoint. In the United States, President Obama has to either talk to Iran or isolate Iran. So I want to know, I'd like each of you to say a little bit about what you think should be the president's approach now, given this movement. Do we refuse to talk to Ahmadinejad or Velayati or somebody else who comes forward as the representative? Do we push for sanctions on Iran or what? I mean, it seems to me we've got to deal from a realistic standpoint with the government that's really there, and which, as far as I can see, is going to be there for many years to come.
I think all the panelists would like to comment on this question. So let's start with Norma.
Let me address that a little bit too. And we just did actually a teach-in in Chicago on Thursday, which was the anniversary, also the Hibdayat here. And just incidentally, so we made some recommendations as well, which I emphasize are my own and some of the other people I'm working with there, not necessarily the panel. But I think that it's very, very important to recognize that, or to offer the possibility that you might be mistaken, that this is not a regime that is solidly in power. This is a regime that knows it's so fragile that they had to steal an election very, very, very obviously. I think if they had been sure of their own base, not only base of support, but ability to maintain power, they could have stolen it more minimally and people might have believed it. But they actually, at this point, have no legitimacy. And this is across all sorts of strata of society. And this is also not just no legitimacy for Ahmadinejad, but also for Khamenei. Khamenei has really undermined his authority tremendously. And that's a position that is based on authority as opposed to power, sort of technical things. So part of what's going on now, I mean, the protests have moved off the street, but the fact that they're off the street doesn't mean nothing is happening. And in fact, in certain ways, more is happening now because it's behind the scenes. I think it was just mentioned briefly that on Thursday there were these protests, but they weren't particularly covered here because people knew that they would be violently repressed. So they were, in fact, instead of being centralized in one public place with 1 million people or something, the understanding was that people should go to their local square for 5 minutes at a time. So come out all at once, chant something, go back home, so that by the time that any security forces can come, nobody's there. And then go out again half an hour later. And this happening all over the city so that there's less of a target. So I think that on the one hand, this is a sign of like ongoing popular struggle, but what's more important to your question is that there is clearly intense fragmentation within the government, within the clerical hierarchy, in terms of behind the scenes negotiations. So that including people who have been conservatives, clerics, administrators, politicians, there's all sorts of deepening cracks. The cracks have been there, but they're deepening and now they're massive. And it's not at all clear that there won't be some kind of resolution of this. This is not finished, and everybody knows that. What that means, that's what I mean when I say long-term optimistic, the question is always what is long-term. So that's the question. Is it 6 months, a year, 4 years, 10 years? I don't know. But what I'd like to address too in terms of that is that my recommendation for the U.S. is that we have managed for 30 years not to have diplomatic relations with Iran, which is appallingly self-defeating on our own part. But at this point, what actually I, myself, and some colleagues are starting to recommend, although up until a month ago we were strongly recommending engagement, unconditional engagement, at this point now, basically we're advocating no military confrontation, no economic sanctions. Both of those will only cause nationalist backlash and crackdown in Iran. What we learned from economic sanctions on Iraq is that they broke the back of civil society. They did not necessarily weaken the regime. But actually, at this point, now that you've had 3 million people come out for a demonstration in Tehran, according to the estimate of the conservative mayor of Tehran, now is not the time for Obama to sit down with this government. Okay? For the Europeans, it's a little different because they have relations. We haven't had relations. Right now, America is loved by the Iranian people because we haven't been there for 30 years. So actually, we haven't really messed up too much, despite the fact that we supported Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq War, something like that. If now, after this massive uprising for democratic rights in Iran, America decides to recognize Ahmadinejad and sit down with him shortly thereafter, Iranians will not forget this because this will actually strengthen his power base tremendously. Part of what is being argued against him by insiders within the government, as well as clerics, as well as others who would otherwise possibly support him, is that he has unnecessarily isolated and endangered Iran. And if he gets the big carrot, and believe me, Iran, Khamenei, Ahmadinejad, they see negotiations with the U.S. as the big carrot. The fact that the conservatives have undermined negotiating possibilities until now is because they wanted to control negotiations, and they think they'll be able to do that now. If he gets this carrot, we, as Americans, will be setting back the possibility of democracy in Iran for years. And for real politic considerations for the U.S., okay, speaking for that position, the U.S. has to think, what do we want? Do we want to actually strengthen a regime that we've had tremendous problems with and the elements in that government that we've had the most problems with, or do we want to encourage a stable ally that we'll be able to work with in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc.? The way to encourage our strategic interests as the U.S. there is not to sit down with this government now. So that's
we have a long list of questions. Yes, I'm going to ask the panelists to be brief in their answers. Nayere, please.
Yeah, I will be very brief
And
because
let all the panelists comment on this question, but briefly.
this is the most urgent question I think all of us are debating within ourselves. And I second all what Norma said very eloquently. And I think just by the report I heard from the Wall Street Journal, actually Ahmadinejad government is now trying to negotiate. It's now they are the ones who are pushing to negotiate with the United States. But I think the U.S. and Obama administration should not fall for that temptation. They are doing this because they are in a position of weakness. And at the moment,
You mean the Iranians?
the Iranians,
Mm.
the Ahmadinejad government is now for negotiation for the first time. Openly, not maybe openly, but they are trying, according to reports, sending a lot of messages, almost begging. But the moment they gain more strength and become consolidated and repress and suppress the whole movement, they're going to play their old game again with the United States. So the Obama government should not be deceived by this kind of the approach of this engagement or the reconciliatory mood that the government of Iran shows. Because if this is not really just a moral test of the Obama government. It's not just a moral issue for the whole international community, how to treat the Iranian indigenous, genuine pro-democracy movement. It's also for the long-term interest of the United States. As someone who is kind of a transnational citizen now, I'm thinking of the interest of not only Iran, but also the United States, because I'm a citizen of the United States. And I think our long-term interest on both sides is that we should not recognize this government. We should not negotiate with Ahmadinejad. Because Iran now, as Norma said, is the most pro-American nation in the Middle East, maybe even in many parts of the world, compared to many parts of the world, especially after Obama came to power. And if we disappoint Iranians, this is going to be another kind of the memory of the coup d'etat of 1951, 53, that, you know, that people are going to just feel so betrayed by the United States. So it is really utmost interest of the United States, not only morally, ethically, but also long-term political interest to wait at least. Wait, and because, again, if they become stronger, because the crack is there, and the crack maybe is not manifest, as Mr. Dreyfus says, they are very powerful, it seems that way, but if they feel the international pressure, the crack is going to show it up more so between even the, you know, conservatives.
The crack open.
It's open, but it's going to become.
Obama said he wanted to talk.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think you have it exactly
I'm sorry.
backwards, but
Yeah.
that's me.
No.
Okay. You know, we know that every government would like to follow its interests, its national interests. And I think there is a common interest between people of Iran and the United States national interests. And I don't want to say the United States do not follow its, national interests. But I want to say right now, it's in this crucial time, they should understand what is the common goal between people of Iran's national interest and the United States national interest. And from this perspective, we should look at to the issue. I would say if this Iran's government, if this dictator could not be trusted by people of Iran, they would crack down people of Iran, they lie to people of Iran, how international community would like to trust them to what negotiation they want to have on nuclear issue and others. Since 2003, this they like to buy the time, especially after 2005. And I am sure by buying the time, this government, because the government has no legitimacy inside Iran, and they do not have any support like some of dictator international support. So what they can do, just making bomb by buying the time. I am sure, I know them, I was part of the government. There is no doubt that from now they will follow up making bomb. So how the government, how Obama and international community want to sit them If they terrorize people of Iran right now by buying time and making real bomb, they will terrorize international community, and this is true. So the second issue, democracy is a global value. United States say, I want to follow democracy, and why they don't want to support the real democracy from Iran? This is an independent movement in Iran. Although Iran's government would like to claim this is like Orange Revolution, Velvet Revolution, the United States, UK, other countries want to give money for this movement, but they know, and this is a psychological war, that they want to say this is sort of Orange Revolution. This is independent revolution. This is a democracy, and don't think so if they stop to coming to a street. This is part of their resistance to continue their protest by not just coming to a street is one sort of resistance. There are many ways to show their resistance, and this movement is going on, and it's good for Obama stand sided with people of Iran, not Khamenei or Ahmadinejad. And last point, I don't want to say they do not negotiate about the nuclear issue, but they can negotiate at the lowest level, not senior level, and at the president's side.
I really would like to ask my panelists to be very brief, because we have to stop the session and each question goes like it. Pari, you want to very brief, please.
All right. I think there are several issues that we have to look at it separately. One is about the social movement, the green social movement. I think it is a grassroots movement. It's a movement that is to certain points separated from what is happening in the...
Should engage or not engage? Please just focus on that.
Because
yeah.
He mentioned that is it finished or not. So the movement is not finished. It will continue regardless of who became the leader. The second issue is that the government inside the Iran, it's not decided. The crack has come, and I agree with you. Because of the position of U.S. government, the crack has come now obvious. It has come to the light, but it hasn't decided. We got to wait to see what will be decided there. Finally, I think eventually, when things are settled in Iran, I don't think that we should isolate Iran. I think that whatever happens in Iran, we got to wait and see and then deal with it. But no matter what, end of the day, whoever takes over, there should be some kind of dialogue with Iran.
Really, very brief.
Yes.
Please.
So it has been said that the schism in the Iranian regime is there. This is very important. Concerning sanctions, I think if sanctions had ever worked, they would have worked so far. They have not. And it was mentioned that it is the population who is the greatest sufferers of them. Negotiating. Now, here I would say what is happening in Europe is very encouraging, because actually we did not expect Europe to engage as far as it has done. You know that Sarkozy, Merkel, and also the situation in Great Britain, who has run off the ranks from the United States, they are now the #1 enemy. They are very pronounced in what they are saying and doing. The situation in Iran is new. We have a history that mostly Western governments have not supported earlier the popular and democratically inclined governments. This is an important lesson to be learned for the future. Secondly, it is important to come up with innovative dances on this very tightrope. Negotiations, yes, but there is not this yes or no, the black and white. There has to be conditions and things going along with it. And to us in Europe, the human rights issue is a very important one. All of the European countries have very close, particularly economic relations for all these years with Iran. We are not against it, but we want to know that there are conditions adhere to that and attack to that. So I think innovative thoughts of how to talk with Iran, how far to go, is very important. The one thing I go along with other panelists is that it is crucial not to invite Iran and acknowledge its regime in the way that, for instance, they should not be invited to international meetings and so on, and give them credit and legitimacy by them, and think twice about acknowledging the results of the election, because even in Iran is the battle still not over. I hope I have not forgotten anything.
Okay, thank you. The lady there has a question. Yes. Oh, you had it. I'm sorry. Okay. Wait for the mic. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Merve Kavakçı from George Washington University. I have very brief, two brief questions just for the whole panel. Almost everyone since the morning has pointed out that this is a common project, in Dr. Marouzi's exact words, mixed movement that is cross-cultural, cross-gender and social classes, this uprising that we are observing in Iran. My first question is about the Iranian women who are not necessarily part of the reformist movement, who are actually trying to make a difference and change some things within the system by being proponents of the conservation of the Islamic Republic as an Islamist republic. Where do they find themselves in this uprising? Do they have any significance in that very cross-cultural, cross-social classes uprising movement? Secondly, looking at the other group, the other camp, the people who are resisting this uprising, proponents of the Ahmadinejad government, are there anyone who are not necessarily hardcore Islamists among them? If there are, what is some of the pretexts that they put forth in their legitimization of their support of this very government? Thank you.
Well, one of the panelists should take a question. We can't go and do all five. One the first one and one the second one. You want to take the first part or the second one?
The first one I can take.
I'll take the second about
you
economic
take the
aspects.
second
Yeah.
one. But both of you have to be very brief, please.
In the context of Iran, we call any woman, be it Islamist, secular, in the sense that they don't believe in Islamic government, non-religious, whoever is trying to work from either within or without the system to change it, to reform it, as reformists. So when you said that those women who are working from within Islamic framework, we still call them reformists because they want to reform. They actually want even to reinterpret Islam, and they don't believe, for example, in the Velayat Faqih, the supreme role, leadership of the supreme jurisprudence. They believe that's an Islamic innovation by Ayatollah Khomeini and is not really part of the Shia tradition and all that. So having said that, there are therefore, as we talked about this coalition of women that include women who are part of this government, who do not want necessarily to topple this system, but want to reform it and to make it more moderate, up to those who don't want anything to do with this government, but they want to change it or bring it down eventually. They work together in these coalitions that I mentioned. Some who don't work within these coalitions, they have also their own independent groups who sometimes are less critical of these coalitions against the government. Nevertheless, they also bring up some issues that are more conservative. Nevertheless, they are critical too. But there are those who are just, peace mouth of the government, who are not critical. So there is a very diverse spectrum of women's activists that we like to have more women like you, Marva. I know your role in Turkey, and I appreciate that a lot. I actually wrote about you in Farsi.
Okay.
Can I just really quickly address, the question you had about ideological support, and I think that's really key too, because I think I said earlier that this is not Islamist versus secularists, whatever. This is one narrow aspect of the government against everybody else. And that's partly, I think, gets confused here because Ahmadinejad is sort of presented as a populist, but he's actually supervised the most extensive economic aspect policies of privatization since the revolution, and this privatization has tended to benefit sort of clients of his administration. And the clients tend to be not necessarily conservative or poor people, but people connected with the security apparatus, with the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij. And this happens, it's both formally in terms of privatization of industry that is being actually then transferred to control by the Revolutionary Guard, so they have actually huge amounts of economic vested interest at this point formally, although it's fairly non-transparent, to the fact that a lot of the Basiji who were brought into, for instance, to Tehran are kids from very rural areas who've been bought off. They say very openly they've been paid like hundreds of dollars a day to do a very short-term repression and then sent home, well, now that maybe have enough money to get married. Okay, so this is not an ideological movement. Now, people don't come out and say, oh, I've just been bought off. You know, the rhetoric is always going to be placed in terms of morality of democracy versus Islam, whatever, versus the morality of the leader versus where's my vote. But in fact, that's why I emphasize so much this looking at social factors and material conditions, that what Ahmadinejad has done over the 4 years is really try to consolidate power, a kind of economic military control over both the economy and the political structure, and that's really where this support is not rural, it's not peasant, it's not poor people, it's really coming from a narrowly but strongly defined base that has economic interests.
Thank you. Charlie, did you have a question? Can you bring them just one. Yes,
Yes, thank you. And I guess my question is just a very brief follow-on. I know that there have been healthy discussions, shall we say, over the years about the impact of economic sanctions. And granted, sanctions are not a perfect tool, but we see in other dictatorship regimes like Cuba, like Iraq under Saddam, that if you remove the sanctions, number one, you're only giving a carrot to the bad guy, and number two, under the privatization, as you say, or under the economic benefits, those are controlled, and there's never any guarantee it gets to the people. So I guess I am wondering if you had any further comment about economic sanctions, removing them, is that only rewarding bad behavior?
Okay, let's take another question. Elaine, you had a question. Elaine Cholino in the back.
Oh, Elaine is here.
Yes. Hmm?
Yes, hi, Elaine Cholino from the New York Times and the Woodrow Wilson Center. There's been some discussion about the erosion of the authority of the leader, and I'm just wondering, has there been any dialogue or debate among women on the role of the Velayati Faqih and whether this position can or should endure? I mean, are women taking on the ultimate father figure in Iran?
Okay, who wants to take the first question and who wants to take the second question? The second or the first? Which
first,
one?
I would like to take first.
The second,
first one.
the first one. You take the first one.
Regarding the sanction, I support a smart sanction, and a smart sanction, and not general sanction against the government. You know, sanction we know has advantage and disadvantage, but we should wait see if we could think about each sanction by itself, that this damage people more or the government more, and then based on if this kind of sanction damage the government, not people as a general, I would think this is a good way of thinking about the sanction.
Okay, who wants to take the leader? Jale, you want to take the
Velayati
leader?
Faqih,
Pari,
no.
you want
I
to
can't
take?
tell the second one if
No.
nobody would like
If
to.
you are addressing me, I mean, I will tell my personal view, but I think there are more competent people
Who
to
wants
answer
to take
this
the
question.
second?
Okay, second one.
Okay.
I just would like to address one word to the father figure. I think it is a very, very important and significant one. I am not aware of any debate among women to this particular, but I think we should be examining that.
Okay, Pari.
Well, I think that what is happening in Iran is they're strategizing their requirements. So at this point, this is not something that they like to add to the debate. At this point, there are other issues that's more feasible, more possible, and I think that the movement inside is focusing on those, than focusing on something which could undermine the movement. So at the moment, I have not heard that debate inside the country. Also, there are those who have raised voice about his position in terms of the recent, uprising, but in terms of removal of the position inside the country, that debate is not started, not openly at least.
You want to
Yeah,
add
just,
something? Yeah, I have you done. I put your name down. I'll get to all of you. Okay, Nayera.
I think actually the position of the Supreme Leader has been damaged after his partisan and partial intervention in this election. Because remember, part of the supporters of Mousavi and Karoubi were conservatives. They were not all against Velayat Faqih. And so by seeing that how the leader took the side of Ahmadinejad, he alienated those women as well as men. And so his own authority and impartiality has been now challenged among many. Now, with regard to the question of whether women want to go for this as a possibility, first of all, it's an unelected position. And I just want also to use the occasion to correct something that was said, that the Supreme Leader has said, yes, women can run for presidency. The Supreme Leader has never said that. Only the spokesperson of the government said that, and he was later kind of by more conservative ayatollahs kind of looked frowned on him and that, what are you talking about? So it was a kind of a campaign game that he did, but then nobody took him seriously. So this, I'm saying this because not only supreme leadership is a male position, but even presidency still in Iran is male position, because they have never defined rajul or the word in the vague word in constitution to mean both men and women. They disqualified a very conservative women candidate, Rafat Bayat, who was part of the conservative camp, and they had no reason to disqualify her. No ideological reason, and she had experience. She was a former deputy. She had all the qualifications to run for presidency. The only reason they disqualified her was her gender. So therefore, the question even hasn't come in the literature. And believe me, I am following the literature of women's movement very closely about whether even to consider to run, because it's not something that you can run for as a supreme leader,
Elaine, maybe if we have time, Fatemeh can pick up that question, whether under the reformist government, when they were debating, the position of the leader, and she was part of that parliament, whether this ever came up. I think we'll leave that for later because we are just pressed for time. Yes. Yes, and then in the back.
Bowman.
No, there's not. The gentleman. No, next.
Oh.
Here. Okay. Yes. And then the back.
Okay.
Please.
Stanley Korber with the Cato Institute. Nothing has been said about the women on the other side of this political divide. What role have they been playing in the last few weeks, and what motivates them?
And the back, please. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, hello, Hafiz. Just to follow up on this question from the New York Times reporter, I believe there have been reports in the New York Times, and perhaps even in the last article in The Nation, reporting that the clerics in Qom have been questioning the Supreme Leader and his authority. And even just yesterday there was an article about how there's talk about replacing the leader with a committee that would then take decisions. That would probably be an oligarchy. But I suppose my question is that, aren't we really underestimating this Shia religious fervor? Whoever is crying for reform, I think, is being held back by the belief that the supreme leader represents the imam who is considered infallible. So the moment he declared the election a victory for Ahmadinejad in that mosque, we saw the fervor of people, almost Hitlerian, calling Ya Allah with that gesture. They, including the Grand Ayatollahs who nominated Khamenei, are all, aren't they, driven by this religious belief that the supreme leader is infallible.
I think there's a difference between demonstrations in the street and attacking the leader than what Elaine was pointing out, whether among the women's movement inside the group there is a discussion on this issue. But we'll get back to that. Who wants to take these two questions on the panel?
There's a very good journal, MERIP, Middle East Report, and they have a website, www.merip.org, and I've contributed to them too, disclaimer. But in the most recent issue, number 250, which is spring 2009, is a special issue on 30 years after the revolution. There's it's full of all sorts of things, but there's a really excellent piece by a colleague of mine on women Basiji. So the women segments of the Basij, and it's much smaller than the men, but they have women's groups. And part of what she discovers in terms of interviewing them is their attitudes, and they tend to be, a lot of them older, but some young women, quite religious. But for one thing, their gender beliefs actually do not match up with, for instance, the policies formulated. They're supporters of the government, but they didn't support individually the attempted reforms of the family law and the marriage law, et cetera, even though these are organized, hardline sort of militias, so to speak. But also that they often see this as they identify with certain kinds of aspects of upward mobility they have through organizing. So it's both ideological in terms of religious identity, but also often about organization in terms of structures of social advancement and mixed with a certain amount of divergence as well from the women's attitudes are very different from the policies putting forth by their male colleagues.
Regarding replacing
you
the
want
leader,
to,
yeah.
but very brief.
Okay, regarding replacing the leader, I would like to give 2 points. One is if, bringing this issue in the media is good, but in reality, this is, it is little bit looks like impossible to replace the leader because of the composition of the Majlis Khobregan. If the movement goes beyond this situation, we see more crackdown on inside the government, then later this issue would come up to the Majlis Khobregan.
Okay. Just give me one minute. The lady here, and then the gentleman in the back. And then we move to this side again. Yeah.
I'm Shala Araste from Voice of America, Persian News Network. I have a question for Norma. Regarding some analysts and those who travel to Iran and are active in women's activities, they express that the movement, although a very successful women's movement, but hasn't reached the small cities and villages, and also especially the group, non-Shiite group, and Kurdish and Baluchis and so forth. How do you think that this movement, women's movement, can reach those groups, which can be, forced to recognize? And also,
I think we'll stop at that. We are running out of time. I'm sorry.
Democracy and human rights can be implemented and addressed under any kind of Islamic regime, which candidates go through filter of the Guardian Council.
Could I ask you to just ask one question because we have just 15 minutes left? Yes, please, in the back.
I'm also with Voice of America, but the English service. I'm just wondering, this experience of young men and women coming together, standing shoulder by shoulder, what effect do you think that will have in future years in terms of the male-female gender relations in Iran when this generation comes of age?
Okay.
Who
about
wants to take
the first one, the first
yes,
question?
Norma was addressed to you very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I'm going to do the same thing I just did before, which is go to www.merit.org and look at this same issue. There's a whole article about women healthcare workers and this very, very widespread national organization of women healthcare workers and how effective they are all over, both in terms of transmitting health education, but also gender education. And so I would want to emphasize that some of what we focus on here, for instance, the 1 million signature campaign, tends to be an urban, upper middle class educated campaign. It is very small, but that doesn't mean there isn't mobilization organization across the country in much smaller places.
Okay. I'm sorry, I won't allow any follow-ups. I'm terribly sorry. Who wants to take the second question?
I take that one.
Hari.
It's a question about the genders.
Yeah, sure.
Yes,
Please.
this public sort of experience, and I think a collective identity was formed during this period of time. In terms of gender segregation, the Iranian youth really never accepted that. And in spite of what was happening or what was shown or all the laws which was enforced upon them, they managed to overcome this. And if you go to social networks, if you go to where they're chatting to one another, you would see that that didn't exist in their mind. So I don't think it's going to make huge difference on that sense. It was already there. Even if we look at the traditional camp, we will see that even they're very comfortable working with one another. So gender segregation, in spite of what happens in the legal system, in the social fabric, never really formed or implemented, regardless of how much they tried. So, but a collective identity has been formed, and I think that is where we will see the change. So there will be this kind of being together.
Yes, please, and then Nadire.
Thank you. It's bad to be one of the last persons to ask a question, but many of the things I had in mind have already been asked. I'm a political scientist. I'm from Bilkent University, Ankara, and I'm here at the moment in Woodrow Wilson Center. This was a very informative analytical session. And analysis, of course, calls for further analysis, and therefore, not being a journalist and all that, I need to ask you, especially Professor Tauhidi, about a couple of points you made, which in my mind need clarification. I mean, I like the way you sort of try to...
and brief, please.
Okay.
Very brief.
It's terrible to try to be brief.
Very brief.
You talked about this movement being non-ideological and pragmatic and non-revolutionary. These terms bother me to some extent, in the sense that it seems that the issue is not just gender specific. It's not just women's issues that are at stake here. Women are on the street fighting against not just discrimination, but for political freedoms, for political democracy. So there's a democracy issue here, which is at large. And to what extent democracy is devoid of ideological or philosophical, you know,
I'm sorry.
sort of background is what bothers me here. Yeah. So, all right, my question. Do you think this movement can articulate broader issues and demands of political democracy and fundamental rights and freedoms without any ideological compass, without ideological vehicles like a political party, for instance, and without broader coalition with male citizens on the other side? And to what extent, this is the first part, to what extent, maybe I should stop here because I'm under pressure right now. Okay, let's leave it at that.
The question, yes.
Thank you. I'm Nadire Shamlu from the World Bank. I'll ask a very, very quick and brief question. This is the period where the future leaders are determined, and people have, this is the face time that people have with these future leaders. What concerns me is that everybody realizes that up to now, women have played a very, very quintessential role in making it happen what we see today. But the question is, like, where do we go from here? And what concerns me is that more and more I see women being portrayed in the media, CNN, Voice of America, BBC, everywhere. When women commentators are coming, Iranian women or whatever, they're usually coming and commenting on women's issues, whereas male commentators come and talk about international relations, about the political events and so on. And in a way, a gender segregation is starting to develop there, that the future leaders are going to be more and more men, and women are only going to be there for gender issues. Is there a way, and this is a question that I would like to put to you, is there a way that we can highlight, and we have women working in every walk of life in Iran as well as outside Iran, that we can also highlight the women who are not necessarily only in the gender line or gender activity, but women who are also elsewhere, so that they too can rise and be there at the table when the future, I don't know, when people are sitting at the table to make the decisions about the future. Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to go first?
I have to go.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know why it bothered you to call this movement non-ideological, pragmatist, and non-revolutionary. I was just describing what not only me but many scholars of Iran are now seeing, a paradigm shift in Iran's political culture. You see, in the 1979, we started up to, say, about 10 years ago, two dominant ideology was the primary discourses. One was the Islamist ideology, revolutionary Islamism, which started by Shariati first and then became fundamentalist by people like Khomeini. And the other ideology that was very important through the past 30 years has been revolutionary leftism, so Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. All of these ideologies that have been important in the movements have failed, both practically and theoretically, not only in Iran but internationally. They haven't been able to deliver. I don't think it's just an opinion, it's just what people have seen. That's why the left in Iran is very divided now and very disillusioned with the version of the communism that, for example, Soviet Union presented. There is a growing, actually, leftist movement within the students today. I'm not saying that the left is over, but there is like a radical left, in kind of a new independent left, which is trying to articulate itself, but still very confused. But Islamism, for sure, is also shifted from the you don't see it in the universities anymore. You don't see it among the intellectuals. You see it mostly among a few who are supportive of Ahmadinejad and still adhere to the Islamist state. So that is what I meant. But I'm not saying there's no ideological people or ideological trends within the movement, but there's no predominant ideology. And people are rallying around mostly human rights as the framework they are using, like the convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights now is very prominent framework that people refer to, and democracy, which is not ideological. It's just rules of the game and competition that they now, in Iran, at unprecedented level, is now being appreciated and looked for as sets of principles. And it's pragmatic because even those who have ideological tendency have learned to be pragmatic and coalition builders. So that's what I mean, and I think these are rather positive. It's helping rather than hindering the movement. But in the long run, I can see your point. It doesn't mean that we don't need political parties, we don't need ideology. People are going to form political parties, especially if we have a little bit of freedom. But the political parties are not leading this movement. Even Mousavi is not leading this movement. That the irony is that Mousavi himself, even the color of the movement was chosen for him by a young man who just came and gave the idea, came from people. So the movement is kind of spontaneous, and Mousavi himself and Karoubi, they were surprised that they were not expecting this much outpour on the streets of people who are, and their slogans are not being dictated from anywhere. It's kind of a horizontal relationship rather than this, horizontal rather than vertical relationship of the movement. There is no single leadership yet, although Mousavi is the point of reference for many, but the movement is now very fluid. It's too soon to say where this is going.
Yeah, I wanted, in a way, to take a position to what you both have said. I think democracy can translate into many phases. When you talk to people, particularly in our part of the world, not many people are clear about what is happening. So it's very important to look at existing and understandable native accesses to democracy. Norma was mentioning gender justice, and I think both justice and gender position are in Islamic countries a very understandable concept. So to go for gender justice is an opening or an access to the question of democracy. And I think things are happening also without too much theory. The presence of women is happening, although I agree with you that one should not exclude the issues of women to be addressed by women, and it is a general thing. But just by doing, they are learning to be present. Look at Iran. Iranian women are visible really in all parts of life. And I'm very cautious about taking one concept of democracy and say, we have to import that one. One has to see how you can dig a channel to this concept.
Norma, you want to take...
Just to follow up the
yeah.
question about women being asked only about women,
Yeah.
that I think it's ironic because actually I think that's more of a problem for the outside media than it is inside. Inside, there are lots of Iranian women journalists. They cover all aspects of society, political, economic, etc. But maybe it's our problem from outside that we expect only women to speak about gender issues and women only to speak about gender issues, especially in countries like Iran. So maybe that's a lesson for ourselves. Exactly.
Do anybody else?
I agree. I totally agree with what Norma said.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, the panelists.